Galactic Council banished humanity. Now empires beg for the human fleet to return. Part 1: The day they threw us out. The gavel came down before I finished my first sentence. That was how it worked in the grand chamber of the Galactic Council. 50 civilizations, 10,000 years of collective history, and not one of them had the patience to hear a human admiral speak in his own defense. Councillor Vale of the Thalesi raised one long silver hand, and the hall went quiet like a machine being switched off. I am Admiral Cale Doran. I commanded the human expeditionary force for 11 years. I have walked across the bridges of burning ships. I have given orders that saved lives and orders that cost them, and I have carried every single one of those decisions without flinching. But standing in that chamber, surrounded by alien faces that had already decided my fate, I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. I felt small. Not afraid, just small. The chamber itself was enormous, shaped like a bowl carved into the heart of Nexus Station, the great hub of the Galactic Council floating in the Orion Arm between a dozen member civilizations. The walls were smooth and pale, and the light inside came from no visible source, just a steady, cold glow that made every species look like a statue of itself. Delegates from the Thalesi, the Vorkai, the Drenathi, the Shal, the Murik, and 44 others were seated in rising tiers above me. I stood alone on the floor of the chamber. My legal advisor, Commander Nora Hale, stood just behind me. She was young, sharp, and honest enough to have told me the night before that the verdict was already written. She had been right about many things in her career. She was right about that too. Vale began to speak. He was tall and silver-skinned, with eyes the color of still water, and a voice that carried the particular tone of someone who had been speaking in rooms like this for centuries. He did not shout. He did not need to. His words landed with the quiet weight of a door closing. The charges against humanity were read as follows: unilateral aggression against a non-threatening species, disregard for the Council resolution on measured force, unauthorized deployment of a military fleet in neutral space, and deliberate escalation of a situation that had been placed under diplomatic review. Every word was technically accurate. Every word missed the point entirely. 6 weeks earlier, the Kreth swarm had struck the colony world of HFY. HFY was not a human colony. It belonged to the Drenathi, a quiet and deeply civilized people who built beautiful things and had no standing military to speak of. The swarm, a collective organism that moved like a storm and fed like a fire, had entered the system and begun consuming everything in its path. The Council, following its established doctrine, had dispatched a diplomatic envoy, a single vessel, with a communication array. I received word of the attack at 0400 hours. I had a battle fleet in the sector for routine patrol. I did not send a message to the Council. I did not file a request. I gave the order and we moved. We reached HFY in 4 hours and 17 minutes. The swarm was already burning through the outer settlements. We engaged immediately. The battle lasted 11 hours. When it ended, the swarm was gone, not retreated, gone. The diplomatic envoy arrived 2 days later to find the planet still standing, and 4 billion Drenathi people alive. The Council's response was not gratitude, it was fury. That was the part I kept coming back to as Vale read the charges in his soft, precise voice. Not the battle, not the cost, not the 11 hours of fire and noise and fear and discipline that had saved an entire civilization. The Council's first instinct, when it learned what we had done, was anger. Nora leaned close and whispered that I should keep my expression neutral. I tried. I cannot say I succeeded. When Vale finished reading, he looked down at me with those still water eyes and asked if I had anything to say before the Council delivered its judgment. I stepped forward. The hall was absolutely silent. I told them that I had received notification of an active and ongoing attack on a populated world. I told them that I had the means to stop it. I told them that I had stopped it. I told them that 4 billion people were alive because of what the human expeditionary force did in those 11 hours, and that if I were placed in the same position tomorrow, I would give the same order without a moment's hesitation. The gavel came down again. Vale said the council had heard enough. The judgment was delivered in 4 parts. First, the human expeditionary force was immediately recalled from all council-adjacent space. Second, humanity's membership status in the Galactic Council was formally suspended, pending review. Third, all trade routes between human space and Council member worlds were closed. Fourth, and most significant, human warships were forbidden from operating beyond the borders of the Sol system. In short, we were banished. Not from a room, not from a station, from the galaxy. I stood on that smooth, pale floor and listened to the sentence, and I did not move. Nora's hand touched my arm for a brief moment and then pulled back. Around me, 50 civilizations sat in their rising tiers and watched. When Vale finished, he folded his hands on the podium in front of him. He looked at me with an expression that I can only describe as satisfied, not cruel, just satisfied, as if a complicated problem had been cleanly resolved. I turned and walked toward the exit. At the door, I stopped. I do not know exactly why. Perhaps it was 11 years of command. Perhaps it was the memory of those 11 hours over HFY. Perhaps it was simply that some things need to be said out loud so they cannot be pretended away later. I looked back at Vale, and I told him that the galaxy was not as safe as the Council believed. I told him that the things moving in the dark between stars did not care about diplomatic resolutions or measured responses. I told him that the day was coming when something large and hungry would arrive at a world that mattered to him, and that on that day, he would want people nearby who knew how to fight. I told him that when that day came, we would not come for free. Then I walked out. The reaction on Earth was exactly what I expected. Some people were ashamed. Some were furious. Some stood in public squares with signs demanding the Council's apology. Some sat quietly at kitchen tables and said nothing at all, which I think was the most honest response of all. I gave one final address to the fleet. I told my officers and soldiers that they had done nothing wrong, that the record of their service was clean and would remain clean regardless of what any council decided, that the work they had done over HFY would echo across the centuries whether or not anyone chose to acknowledge it. I retired 3 months after the banishment took effect. I moved to a cabin on the eastern coast of Nova Scotia, on a bluff above the Atlantic. I fished. I read. I grew a small garden that produced more tomatoes than I could reasonably eat. I kept no screens in the main room, and I checked the news only on Tuesdays. I tried to let it go. My junior aide, a young man named Owen Price, visited me in the 2nd month. He brought a bottle of something expensive and 2 glasses, and we sat on the porch in the cold evening air and watched the ocean move. After a while, he asked me if I really believed what I had said to Vale at the chamber door. He asked it carefully, the way young people ask questions they are not sure they are allowed to ask. I watched the water for a long time before I answered. I told him I did not believe it. I told him I knew it. He nodded slowly and poured us each another measure, and we sat in silence for a while longer, listening to the sea. That was 20 years ago. Part 2, 20 years of silence. The rain that night came in off the ocean sideways, the kind that finds the gaps in every door and window and reminds you that the world outside does not particularly care about the world inside. I had just put out the fire and was heading to bed when I heard a vehicle on the gravel path below the bluff. I stood at the dark window and watched the headlights cut through the rain and stop outside my door. I was not alarmed, I was annoyed. Commander Nora Hale stood on my porch a minute later, soaking wet from her collar to her boots, holding a data chip between 2 fingers as if it were a live coal she was not entirely sure she should be carrying. She had not changed much in 20 years. A few lines at the corners of her eyes, gray at her temples, the same expression she had always worn in difficult situations, which was the expression of someone who had already thought of every way the next 10 minutes could go badly and had decided to proceed anyway. I opened the door wider and said nothing. She walked in. I made coffee while she stood near the stove and stopped dripping. She placed the data chip on my table without being asked. I did not look at it. I set 2 mugs down and sat across from her and waited. She told me the chip had come through a courier contact she had maintained since leaving active service. The source was a Thalesi dissident, named something unpronounceable in any human language, who had spent the last 3 years quietly pulling council intelligence files and feeding them to a small network of people who believed the council's silence on certain matters was becoming dangerous. I picked up the data chip then. It was small and ordinary looking. It told me nothing by its appearance. I asked Nora what was on it. She told me to read it myself and then decide what I thought. I plugged it into the old reader on my shelf, the one I had kept more out of habit than intention, and I read. It took me 40 minutes to get through everything. Nora sat at the table and drank her coffee and did not speak. The fire I had just put out I rebuilt without thinking about it, because the room had gone cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. The picture in those files was not good. I had known, in the general and distant way that a retired admiral reads the stars and draws rough conclusions, that the Kreth swarm had not simply vanished after a HFY. In the 20 years since the banishment, there had been quiet reports, rumors filtered through trading contacts and civilian networks, of activity in the outer rim. Nothing confirmed. Nothing the council had chosen to announce. The files told a different story. The swarm had not died at a HFY. It had adapted. The collective organism that we had shattered in those 11 hours had not broken. It had learned. Something in its nature, something in the way it processed encounters and integrated experience, had absorbed the lesson of that battle and produced a new generation of itself that was faster, more coordinated, and significantly harder to disrupt. The second wave had emerged 3 years earlier, further out in the rim, and it had been burning ever since. 6 council member worlds had lost colonies. 2 smaller civilizations were facing the kind of losses that people write different words for, the words that come after all the ordinary words have stopped being large enough. The council had been responding in the only way it knew how: measured force, diplomatic hails, controlled engagements with strict rules of containment. Every engagement had failed, not because the council's military forces were weak. They were not weak, but there is a particular kind of opponent that does not respond to measured force, and the swarm was exactly that kind. It did not negotiate. It did not pause. It did not read proposals or consider alternatives. It moved and it consumed and it adapted, and the forces sent against it kept dying in careful, well-documented ways. I put down the reader. Nora was watching me. I asked her how long she had known. She said she had been piecing it together for about 8 months, and that the chip from the Thalesi dissident had filled in the gaps she could not reach from public sources. She said she had taken 3 weeks to decide whether to come to me. She said she had almost not come. I asked her why she had. She looked at her coffee for a moment and then looked at me and said that the Drenathi had lost their homeworld's moon. Not a colony. The moon in orbit above the homeworld itself. 40 million people. One night. I sat with that for a while. Outside, the rain was still coming in sideways. The fire had caught again and was doing its best. I told her the council made their choices. I told her they had a doctrine and they had followed it, and that was the path they had chosen when they threw us out of the chamber and closed every door behind us. I told her there were consequences to decisions, and that the council was living in theirs. She did not argue, she did not push, she just waited. That was always Nora's method. She had learned it long before she served with me, in some classroom or courtroom or difficult room I had never been in. She knew how to let silence do the work. I thought about the Drenathi elder who had stood in the back row of the council chamber on the day of my sentencing. She had been small and gray-skinned and had not spoken during the proceedings, but I had seen her face when the verdict was delivered. She had not looked satisfied, the way Vale had. She had looked tired and something beyond tired. I stood up and walked to the window. The ocean was invisible in the dark and the rain, but I could hear it, the same way I had always heard it in the 20 years since I moved here. I thought about what 20 years of isolation had actually done to humanity. The Council had expected it to diminish us. Most of them had probably expected us to fracture, to lose the industrial and scientific thread that external trade had helped us build, to quietly decline into a minor regional species with a history of overreach. They had not understood something fundamental about what happens when you take a problem-solving species and lock it in a room. We had not declined, we had rebuilt. Cut off from Council supply chains, we had engineered our own. Cut off from their shipyards and their materials markets, we had gone back to our own ore, our own designs, our own manufacturing, and we had gone further than we had gone before because we had no one's permission to wait for. Cut off from their academic exchange programs, our own research institutions had filled the silence with a speed that surprised even us. The Sol Compact, as our governance had come to be called, was the most self-sufficient civilization in the known galaxy. Nobody on the outside had been watching closely enough to notice. They had been too busy watching the swarm. I thought about our fleet. 20 years of refinement, new drive systems, new hull configurations, new engagement software built around lessons learned at HFY IV and 100 simulations run since. The fleet we had in the Sol system now was not the fleet that had fought the swarm over a Drenathi colony world. It was something considerably beyond that. It had nowhere to go, by order of the Galactic Council. I finished my coffee. I set the mug on the counter. I looked at Nora and asked her if she still had contacts in the coordination network. She said she did. I asked her if she could get a message to a specific set of people without going through any channel the Council monitored. She said she could probably manage it. I told her to get the old crew on the line, not to mobilize, not to file anything or move anything or change any orders, just to locate them, just to find out where they were and whether they were still sharp. She asked me what I was planning. I told her I was not planning anything, I was listening. I told her the galaxy was burning and that somewhere out there, very proud and very ancient beings were approaching a moment they had never approached before. A moment where every other option had been tried and exhausted and the thing left standing, the one remaining solution, wore a human face. I told her they were going to ask, and that I wanted to be ready to have a conversation when they did. Nara looked at me for a moment, then nodded once, picked up her coat from the chair and moved toward the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame and asked, without looking back, if I had thought about what it was going to cost. I told her I had thought about very little else. She walked out into the rain. I watched her lights move down the path and disappear. I sat back down at the table with the data chip and the cold coffee and the sound of the ocean, and I did not sleep for a very long time. Part 3: The Begging Hour. Kepler Station had not been in active use for 15 years. It sat at the edge of human-permitted space like an old key on a hook, its lights on minimal power, its corridors clean but empty, a relic of the early expansion era when humanity had still believed the Council might one day welcome us as equals. Nobody had been posted there since the banishment. Nobody had bothered to decommission it either, which suited my purposes exactly. I arrived on a shuttle with a crew of 6. No weapon declaration, no formal protocol filed. We docked in the secondary bay, and I walked down a corridor that still had the old crew rotation schedules pinned to the wall under a thin layer of dust. I was wearing my uniform. I had debated that for a long time. 20 years is a long time to not wear a thing. But I decided in the end that this meeting required clarity, and a retired admiral in a fishing sweater sends a certain kind of message that a serving admiral in full dress does not. They were already there when I arrived. 3 of them seated at the round table in the station's main conference room. The overhead lights were at half strength, and the room smelled of stale, recycled air and something faintly chemical. It was not a comfortable room. I suspected that was intentional on nobody's part, just an accident of circumstance that happened to reflect the nature of what was about to take place. Councillor Vale was the first face I recognized. 20 years had done to him what time does to the very old, not diminished him exactly, but concentrated him, stripped away whatever smoothness had once softened his edges. He was seated at the far side of the table with his hands folded in front of him, and when I walked in he looked up and held my gaze without blinking. Beside him sat a Vorkai war marshal whose name translated roughly as Grath, and who wore the scarred, rigid bearing of a soldier who had been losing battles he should have won. The Vorkai were not a species accustomed to losing. They were tall and gray-scaled, and built along lines that suggested geological permanence, and Grath looked like he had spent the last 3 years trying to hold a wall together with his bare hands, while the wall kept deciding otherwise. The third was the Drenathi Elder. I recognized her immediately. She was the same woman who had sat in the back row of the council chamber on the day of my sentencing. She was considerably older now, and the gray of her skin had deepened toward something closer to ash. She held herself very still in her chair, the way people hold themselves still when stillness is the last reliable thing they have. I sat down. My aide, Lieutenant Owen Price, the same young officer who had asked me the question on my porch 20 years ago and was no longer young, stood against the wall behind me and said nothing. I let the silence in the room sit for a moment, then another, then one more after that. Vale spoke first. He said that the council had convened this meeting in an unofficial capacity, outside of formal session, with the understanding that what was discussed here would not appear in any council record until both parties had reached a preliminary agreement. I told him I understood. He said the council was aware of the current situation in the Outer Rim. I told him I was also aware. He said the council had evaluated its strategic position with great care and had concluded that there were aspects of the current conflict that fell outside the operational parameters its member forces had been trained and equipped to address. I waited. He said nothing for a moment. I said his name, just the one word, quietly. He looked at me. I told him that this room was not a council session. There was no record being kept, no gallery watching, no history being written in real time. I told him that what I needed from him in this room in plain language was the actual sentence, the real one, not the sentence built for an audience. Something moved across his face, not quite pain, something more complicated than pain. He said, with a care and a steadiness that I will admit cost him more than he let show, that the council was requesting the assistance of the human expeditionary force. The room was very quiet. I let it stay quiet. Then I asked him to say it again, and to include the word he had left out. He looked at me for a long time with those still water eyes. Then he said, clearly and without decoration, that the council was asking for help. I nodded, then I began. I asked them to tell me about the engagements, all of them, every encounter with the swarm in the last 3 years, every fleet sent, every doctrine applied, every result. I asked Grath to walk me through the Vorkai's most recent operation in detail, the one I had read about in the intelligence files Nora had brought me. He did, and as he spoke I watched his jaw tighten incrementally, the way a soldier's jaw tightens when he is narrating his own failures to someone he does not yet trust. When he finished, I asked him what had gone wrong. He said the swarm had adapted to their approach. It had learned their formation patterns and began targeting the weakest points in their line before the line could close. I asked him what change they had made in response. He said they had reinforced the weak points. I asked what happened next. He said the swarm targeted the places where the reinforcement had come from. I nodded. I asked the Drenathi Elder about the moon. She spoke for 10 minutes without any change in her expression, and what she described was so complete and so exact in its devastation that I understood without being told why she had been sent to this meeting. She was not here as a diplomat. She was here as evidence. When she finished, I sat back and looked at the table for a moment. Then I laid out my terms. Full operational autonomy for the human expeditionary force in all engagement decisions. No council oversight, no doctrine review, no committees. My fleet, my calls. Second, humanitarian guarantees. every human civilian in Council-adjacent space to receive full protections under Galactic law for the duration of the operation and permanently thereafter. Third, resumption of all trade routes between human space and Council member worlds, effective immediately upon agreement. Fourth, a formal review of the banishment to begin within 60 days of the conclusion of active hostilities. Grath began to object to the first term before I had finished statting it. He said that autonomous human engagement decisions were precisely what had led to the original crisis. I told him, without raising my voice, that the original crisis had resulted in 4 billion people being alive, and that his review of the HFY situation would benefit from beginning with that fact rather than ending with it. He stopped talking. I moved to my 5th term. I said that I required a formal, permanent entry in the Galactic record, acknowledging that the banishment of humanity had been unjust. The air in the room changed. Vale's folded hands pressed together more firmly. Grath stared at the table. The Dranathi elder did not move. Vale said that a formal entry of that nature would represent an extraordinary concession, and that the Council would require significant internal discussion before any such language could be approved. I told him I understood. Then I placed both palms on the table and stood up. I told them the terms were complete and non-negotiable, and that I would return to Earth and await their response. I told them I expected the response within 72 hours. I moved toward the door. I had my hand on the frame when I heard the sound, a soft scrape of a chair against the floor. I turned. The Dranathi elder had risen from her seat. She crossed the room and stood in front of me, and she looked up at me with eyes that had seen a moon fall. She did not speak. She reached out and wrapped both of her small 6-fingered hands around my right wrist and held it. She did not pull me back. She did not ask. She just held. I looked down at her hands, then at her face. I thought about 40 million people on a moon. I thought about what it means to reach out and hold the wrist of a person you came to beg, and what that costs when you are a civilization that has never begged for anything. I stood there for a long moment. Then I turned and walked back to my chair and sat down. Owen was already moving. He pulled out his communication device and composed a short encrypted message to the Sol Compact Command Coordination Network. The message was 4 words. It had been agreed upon 20 years earlier, during the last operational briefing before the banishment took effect, back when several of us had believed, quietly and without saying it aloud, that this day would eventually come. The message read, "Dust off the fleet." I looked across the table at Vale. He met my eyes. I told him we would agree to the terms on the condition that the Galactic record entry was drafted and signed before any human ship crossed the outer border. Not after, not pending, before. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said he would see what could be arranged. I told him to arrange it quickly. The swarm, as best I knew, was not waiting. Part 4, we fight like humans. The fleet crossed the outer border on a morning that felt like every morning before a fight, which is to say it felt like standing at the edge of something large with your eyes open, and your hands steady, and your mind running through everything you know and everything you do not know simultaneously. The lead ship was the Earth Defense Cruiser Dauntless, and I stood on its bridge with my hands clasped behind my back and watched the stars shift color as we passed through the Council's outer marker and into restricted space for the first time in 20 years. The border sensor pings from the nearest Council observation post came through immediately. Then a long pause. Then a single brief transmission from Nexus Station. It said, "Welcome." I told my communications officer, Lieutenant Commander Petra Walsh, to log the timestamp and file it with the mission record. She did, and I saw her bite back something that was not quite a smile. Behind the Dauntless, 140 human warships followed in formation. Behind us in Sol's system, another 320 stood ready to move on a second order. This was not the fleet we had been 20 years ago. These ships were longer, quieter, and considerably more capable, and the people who crewed them had spent 2 decades training for an enemy they had never been allowed to face. They were ready, I had made certain of it. We rendezvoused with the Council's joint force at a staging point 4 light hours from the current front. The Council fleet was large, professionally maintained, and visibly exhausted. Ships that had been in continuous rotation showed the particular kind of weariness that does not live in the metal but in the people inside it. I have always been able to read it from a distance. You look at the way a crew moves across a deck, and you know whether they believe they can win. These crews did not believe they could win. The Council's operational commander was Grath himself, the Vorkai War Marshal from Kepler Station. He came aboard the Dauntless for the initial briefing with 2 of his senior officers, and the look of a person who had agreed to something he was not yet certain he had understood. He sat across the table from me in the briefing room, and I spread the tactical maps between us, and he did not touch them. He asked me how I intended to proceed. I told him I intended to proceed the way the situation required, which was the only way I had ever known how to operate. I told him I would need full telemetry from his most recent engagements, all of it, including the reports his officers had filed privately, and the ones that did not appear in the official council summaries. He looked at me for a moment, and then told his aide to pull everything. Good, that was a better start than I had expected. The first engagement came faster than anyone had planned, because the swarm did not wait for humans to finish their briefings. The alert came in at 0200. A swarm advance cluster had appeared at the edge of the Drenathi secondary colony system, the same one the intelligence reports had flagged as the next probable target. It was moving quickly, faster than any previous contact had moved, and the Council's local defense force had already engaged and was struggling. I ordered the fleet to move. I told Grath to keep his force in reserve for the first phase. He objected. I reminded him of the terms of our agreement, clearly and without heat. He clenched his jaw and stood down. Here is what the Council's doctrine said to do in this situation. Hold formation, establish a defensive perimeter, engage the swarm along a controlled front, and prevent penetration at all costs. Here is what I did instead. I sent 30 ships directly at the leading edge of the swarm and told them to make a great deal of noise. Then I pulled the rest of the fleet into 4 groups and pushed them wide, out past the flanks, further than the swarm would have calculated for based on every previous engagement it had ever recorded. The swarm tracked the 30 ships and adjusted its approach. It moved to contain them, the way it had contained every council formation it had ever faced. Then the 4 groups hit it from outside its attention. Not a clean victory. Nothing is clean. We lost 4 ships in the opening exchange, and the names of the people inside them were names I would carry from that day forward the way I had always carried names. Lieutenant Oliver Dean, Ensign Carla Sutton, Petty Officer Grant Webb and his entire crew, 26 people in total. But the swarm broke. It did not die. It splintered, lost cohesion, pulled back into itself. And a swarm that was pulling back was a swarm that was not consuming. Grath watched the engagement from the Dauntless Bridge. He did not speak during it. When it was over, he stood very still for a long moment and then asked me, in a voice that had changed somewhat from the voice he had used at Kepler Station, how I had known it would work. I told him I had not known. I had calculated. There was a difference. He asked me what the difference was. I told him that knowing meant waiting for certainty before acting, and that certainty in a battle against an adaptive opponent was a position you could wait for forever. Calculating meant taking the best information available and moving before the situation could change in ways that cost you more than the risk of movement. He looked at the star map for a long time. That evening, I held a memorial on the Dauntless for the 26 people we had lost. I read every name aloud. I asked the crew to stand in full, and I gave them 1 minute of silence for each name, and the room was very quiet and very serious, and nobody left early. I had arranged for the feed to go to the observation stations where Grath's officers were monitoring our operations. I wanted them to see it. I wanted them to understand that when I said we would take casualties, It was not an abstraction. After the memorial, Lieutenant Commander Walsh told me she had received a private message from one of Grath's senior officers asking if this was a standard human command practice. I told her to reply that it was. Over the next several weeks, something happened that I had not entirely anticipated, though perhaps I should have. The alien officers assigned to our joint command began to change. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the small, practical ways that matter on a long campaign. They began showing up to briefings before the scheduled time. They began filing their own engagement reports in a different style, less focused on process and more focused on outcome. A young Thalesi navigation officer named something that Owen translated loosely as Sen requested permission to observe our tactical training sessions. I gave it. 3 weeks in, Grath himself asked me a question I had not expected. We were in the small officers' mess late at night, both of us with coffee, which he had begun drinking on about the second week, and he asked me why humans fought this way. He did not mean the tactics specifically. He meant the broader thing, the willingness to engage at full force for a species other than our own, the way our soldiers did not seem to need to be convinced that the Drenathi colonists or the Vorkai outposts were worth protecting. I thought about it for a moment. I told him it was not complicated. I told him that when something moved through the galaxy consuming the living, it threatened everything that was living, and that we were living, and that was all the argument we had ever needed. He was quiet for a while. Then he said that his species had a philosophical framework that placed obligation to one's own civilization above obligations to others, that this was considered not selfish but rational, and that it had guided Vorkai policy for 800 years. I said that 800 years was a long time to hold a policy. He looked at me. I said nothing more and let him think. The swarm adapted again. It always adapted. This time it introduced a new pattern targeting civilian vessels in the system lanes rather than engaging military forces directly. The calculations were clear. If it could draw our fleet out of its coordinated position to cover scattered civilian targets, it could then isolate and destroy the military elements one by one. Every conventional instinct said to hold position. The doctrine, both ours and the Council's, was clear. Military formation integrity is the foundation of fleet engagement. You do not sacrifice position for individual rescue operations. You hold and you control the engagement space, and you accept the cost. I watched the civilian transponder signals appear on the tactical screen. 3 transports, a research vessel and a colony supply ship, all in open lanes, all broadcasting distress signals. Grath said quietly from beside me that the doctrine recommendation was to maintain formation. I told him I heard him. Then I broke formation. I sent 12 ships on divergent rescue vectors and reorganized the remaining fleet into a tighter configuration around what I had been building for 2 weeks. The swarm, which had been watching our patterns with the patience of something that has no concept of patience because it does not experience time the way individuals do, responded exactly as I had calculated. It pursued the divergent ships. It saw the opportunity it had been designed to see. It did not see the mines we had seeded along every probable pursuit vector over the previous 4 days. We lost 3 ships covering the civilians. Good ships, good people, I will not pretend otherwise. But the trap closed. The swarm's advance formation was caught between the minefield and the reorganized main fleet, and what happened next was not clean or elegant, but it was final. When the engagement ended, the front line had moved forward for the first time in 3 years. I stood on the Dauntless Bridge and looked at the updated tactical map, and felt the particular silence that comes after something very loud stops. Petra Walsh informed me that Nexus Station was requesting a communication channel. I told her to put it through. Vale's face appeared on the screen. He was in what I recognized as his private office, not the council chamber, and the light there was warmer and older than the light in the grand chamber had been. He looked at me for a long moment and said nothing. Then he said he was beginning to understand. I looked at him. I thought about 20 years. I thought about the chamber door and what I had said to him standing in it. I thought about 4 billion Drenathi people alive on a world that should have burned. I told him there was still work to do. Then I cut the channel and went back to my maps. Part 5, we don't forget but we decide. There is a particular quality to a quiet that follows a long conflict. It is not the same as ordinary quiet. It is heavier, more self-aware. It knows what it replaced, and so do the people inside it. I returned to Earth on a clear autumn morning, 11 months after the Dauntless crossed the outer border. The sky over the landing field was the specific shade of blue that only exists in the early hours of an October morning, and I stood on the tarmac for a moment before moving toward the reception line, just breathing it, the cold and the smell of dry leaves, and the distant sound of the ocean that was 20 kilometers away and somehow still present in the air. The formal ceremony at Nexus Station had taken place 6 weeks earlier. I had not been present for the writing of the Galactic record entry, but I had been present for the reading. The chamber was full. Every seat in the tiered gallery was occupied by delegates from all 50 member civilizations, and the light inside was the same cold, sourceless glow I remembered from 20 years ago, and the floor was the same smooth, pale surface on which I had once stood and been sentenced. I stood there again, in the same place, and listened to Vale read. The language of the formal entry was precise and unadorned. The Council of Galactic Member Civilizations formally acknowledged that the suspension of humanity's membership, enacted in the year 2387, had been enacted in error, that the actions of the Human Expeditionary Force over HFY had been consistent with the foundational principles of galactic civilization, and that the subsequent banishment had caused harm to the human people that was unwarranted and unjust. Vale read every word of it himself. His voice did not waver. There was no hesitation, no softening of the language, no attempt to read it in a tone that made it seem smaller than it was. He read it the way a person reads something they have decided to accept completely, and when he finished, he looked up and met my eyes across the chamber floor. I held his gaze and nodded once. He nodded back. I respected him more in that moment than I had in all the years preceding it. It is not a small thing to stand in front of the world and say you were wrong. Most people, in my experience, would rather find a way to be technically accurate in a description of their errors than to say the plain word. Vale said the plain word, into the permanent record of galactic civilization, with 50 delegations watching. That counted for something. Owen Price, standing behind me in the ceremony as he had stood behind me in every significant room for nearly 25 years, leaned forward after the reading and asked me quietly what I was thinking. I told him I was thinking about coffee. He laughed very softly and said that was probably the right response. Back on Earth, the debate was already going. It had been going before the ceremony. It would go on long after I had stopped following it closely. The question was simple to state and genuinely complicated to answer. What did humanity do now? Half the country, in polls I found myself reading despite my better judgment, said we should take our seat at the council table. Full membership, permanent delegation, a voice in the decisions that shaped the galaxy, because we had just demonstrated in the most vivid terms possible that we were precisely the kind of civilization that should be shaping those decisions. The people who held this position were not wrong about the reasoning. The other half said we were better alone, that the council had banished us once and could banish us again if the political winds shifted, that the same bureaucratic structure that had failed against the swarm was still the same bureaucratic structure, better informed perhaps and chastened certainly, but not fundamentally changed, and that the Sol Compact had flourished in isolation in a way it might not flourish in partnership. The people who held this position were not wrong about the reasoning either. I was asked to speak publicly about it more times than I could count. I declined every request. I had been the commander of the operation, not a politician, and the question of what we did with the result was properly a question for our elected people and our public debate, not for the admiral who had been carrying around a 20-year-old chip on his shoulder and a set of fishing rods. But I kept a personal log. I had kept it since the banishment, and I wrote honestly in it in a way I could not speak publicly. What I wrote was this: the council was not the enemy. I wanted to be clear about that in my own record because I knew that in the way history is remembered, the clean narrative would be simpler than the true one. The clean narrative says, humanity was wronged, humanity proved itself, humanity triumphed, and there is truth in it. But there is also this: Vale and his council were not villains. They were the product of a philosophy that had worked, more or less, for 10,000 years, and that philosophy had a flaw in it, a deep one, a structural one, the belief that measured response was always preferable to decisive force. In a galaxy where most conflicts were political and most threats could be negotiated with, that philosophy was not wrong. It was just not universal. What they had never encountered before humanity was a species that had been forged in a very different fire. We came from a small world with limited resources and a long history of threats that did not negotiate. We had been prey before we were predators. We had been cold and hungry before we were architects. And somewhere in those long and difficult centuries, we had built into ourselves a particular reflex. When something threatens the living, you do not study it. You stop it. You stop it with everything you have, and you ask questions when the immediate danger is removed. That reflex had looked like aggression to species who had never needed it. From where I was standing, it looked like survival. I thought about Grath. I had received a message from him 2 weeks after returning to Earth, formal in its structure but warmer in its tone than I would have predicted from the Vorkai Marshal I had met at Kepler Station. He wrote that the Vorkai High Command had voted to send a delegation to the Human War Academy on Mars, not for observation, for enrollment. He wrote that he personally had recommended the program to 12 of his senior officers, and that he intended to file a formal proposal to restructure the Vorkai engagement doctrine, using what he had observed in our joint operations. He signed the message with his name, and then added beneath it a single line in Vorkai military script that Owen translated for me. It read, roughly, "The wall holds if the builders agree on what holds it." I sat with that for a while. I thought about Sen, the young Thalesi navigation officer who had watched our tactical training with such careful attention. I had been told, through Nora's still-active contact network, that Sen had returned to the Thalesi academic establishment and submitted a proposal for a new course of study focusing on what they were calling adaptive engagement theory. The proposal had been approved. The first cohort of students began in the spring. I thought about what it meant that the first request for a joint patrol treaty had come not from the Thalesi or the Vorkai but from the Shao, a species so small and so quiet that most council members forgot they existed. The Shao occupied 3 systems at the edge of the outer rim, directly in the path of whatever the swarm might produce next, and they had sent a message to the Sol Compact that was brief and direct, and asked without ceremony whether we would consider including their system in any future patrol rotation. We said yes. Obviously, we said yes before they finished asking. And then 42 other small requests followed over the next several months, from small civilizations and minor member worlds and outposts and colonies and research stations that had watched the joint operation and drawn their own conclusions. Not begging, not demanding, just asking, with the particular quiet dignity of people who have decided to trust something and are not entirely sure they should, but are doing it anyway. Something in the galaxy had shifted. I could feel it in the quality of the messages that came in the changed tone of the Council's official communications, in the way the word human was being used in galactic discourse, not as a concern, not as an unpredictable variable in a calculation, as something closer to an anchor. I do not say that with pride exactly. Pride is too simple a word for it. It is more like recognition, the recognition of something that was always true being acknowledged at last. I was sitting on my porch on a cold November morning, watching the Atlantic move under a flat gray sky when Nora arrived. She did not knock. She walked around the side of the house and up the porch steps and sat down in the other chair and looked at the ocean with me for a while before saying anything. She asked me if I had received the council's formal offer. I told her it had come in the previous evening. Full restoration of membership, permanent seat, enhanced status given the circumstances, which meant effectively a position of significant influence in council deliberations, a title I had not asked for and was not certain I wanted. She asked me what I was going to do. I picked up a flat stone from the bowl I kept on the porch railing, a habit I had started in the early years of retirement, collecting smooth stones from the beach below. I turned it over in my palm and then let it fly off the edge of the porch. It skipped 3 times across the top of the damp grass before coming to rest. I told her I was going to think about it. She said she suspected I had already thought about it quite thoroughly. I told her she was probably right. The truth was this: I believed the council offer was genuine. I believed Vale meant what he had said in the ceremony and what he had written in the record, and I believed the member civilizations that had voted for the offer had done so with sincerity and with an honest reckoning of what had happened between us. I was not being offered a seat out of guilt alone. I was being offered a seat because 50 civilizations had watched humanity operate in the field and had concluded, with varying degrees of comfort, that the galaxy was better with us inside the room. And I believed they were right. But there was a condition. Not a formal one, not one I could write into a treaty or enter into a record, just a truth I held in my own understanding of what it would mean to go back. The doctrine had to change. The structural belief that measured response was always correct, that decisive force was always suspect, that the willingness to act without a committee's approval was always a flaw rather than sometimes a necessary quality, that belief had to be examined honestly and corrected where the evidence demanded it. Not abandoned, examined. The council was full of brilliant and ancient minds, and their caution had preserved peace for millennia, and that was worth something real. But caution without the capacity for swift and decisive action, in a galaxy that contained things like the swarm, was an incomplete philosophy. I had said as much in a private meeting with Vale 2 weeks before the ceremony. He had been quiet for a long time after I spoke. Then he had said, in that careful voice of his, that the council had begun a formal review of the doctrine of measured force following the joint operation, that the review was being led by a committee that included, for the first time, 2 military commanders with direct field experience, that the initial findings were expected within 6 months. I had told him that was a good beginning. He had said he hoped so. That conversation was why I was seriously considering the offer, not the title, not the influence, the review, the actual structural reckoning. That was what made it worth sitting down in a room again. Nora was still beside me on the porch, watching the ocean, waiting with the patience that was entirely her own. I told her to send a message to the council's office. I told her to tell them that Admiral Cale Doran would accept the seat on one condition, and the condition was not a demand but a request, that his first act as humanity's permanent representative to the Galactic Council would be to co-chair the Doctrine Review Committee. She looked at me sideways. I told her I was not done with the work yet. She took out her communication device and composed the message while I sat in the cold November air and watched the Atlantic, which had been doing exactly what it was doing now long before any human being had stood at its edge and thought about the stars, and would be doing it long after all of us had gone on to whatever came next. Owen Price arrived at the bottom of the porch steps 20 minutes later, slightly out of breath, carrying a container of very good coffee that he had apparently driven 40 minutes to obtain from the only place in the province that made it the way I preferred. He climbed the steps and set it on the railing, and looked at me with the expression he had been wearing since the day he was a junior aide asking questions on a porch in the rain. He asked me if we were going back. I told him we were. He said after a moment that it was about time. I told him to stop talking and pour the coffee. He did. We sat in the cold morning and looked at the gray water and did not say anything else for a while, and it was exactly the kind of quiet that knows what it has replaced and is at peace with it. The galaxy had not changed. The darkness between stars was the same darkness it had always been, full of things that moved without asking permission and consumed without consideration and adapted without mercy. That was not going to change. But the people who had to face it had changed, a little. A Vorkai marshal had changed. A Thalesi student had changed. An ancient silver counselor who read his own mistakes into a permanent record without flinching had changed. And 50 civilizations watching a human fleet operate in the dark had learned something that could not be unlearned, which was that there was a way to be both swift and careful, both decisive and moral, both willing to act and willing to hold the names of the fallen in your memory long after the action was done. We were not perfect. No species is. We had our history of failures and our long catalog of things we had done badly and would have to carry. But we had also built something in those 20 years of silence, something we had not fully seen the shape of until we took it out into the stars and used it. And what we had built was a version of ourselves that was worth the seat at the table. Not because we were the strongest. Not because we were the most ancient or the most wise. Because we showed up. Because when the living were threatened, we moved toward the threat without waiting for consensus. And because after the threat was stopped, we stood in a quiet room and said the names of everyone it had cost us. And because we held all of that, the moving and the mourning, inside the same people without asking them to choose between the two. That was the thing the galaxy had begged for in the end. Not our fleet, not our tactics, not our weapons or our drive systems or our 20 years of pent-up capability. They had begged for the human capacity to look at the darkness and decide. I had decided. I finished my coffee. The ocean moved. The day began. And